A crowded courtroom, filled with murmurs and shifting eyes. The air was thick, not just with the weight of legal matters but with something darker, something rotting beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. The officer stood tall, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the sterile overhead lights. A symbol of authority. Of control. He had always been in control. He believed he owned this space, that the power in this room bent to his presence. And then he saw her. A black woman. Standing there, silent, unmoved by the storm of his presence. He had noticed her before, but not as someone worth remembering. She wasn't a judge. She wasn't a prosecutor. Just another face in the courtroom. Another nobody. He stepped closer, the leather of his boots pressing into the carpet as if to crush whatever lay beneath them. He saw something in her eyes that unnerved him, something calm, unreadable. He didn't like it. "Why the hell are you even here?" he spat, his voice low but venomous. "You think you can just walk in and act like you matter?" She didn't react. She didn't blink. That infuriated him. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. The murmurs in the courtroom grew. People shifted in their seats. Something about the way she just stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed together in an almost smirk, it set something off inside him. His chest rose. His fingers twitched. "Answer me, you damn," the slap cracked through the air like a gunshot. For a split second, the entire room seemed to freeze. A bailiff gasped. A clerk's pen dropped to the desk. The judge's mouth fell slightly open, caught between disbelief and hesitation. The woman's head had turned slightly from the impact, her cheek stinging, red. But she didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She simply turned back, slowly, methodically, and locked eyes with him once more. The officer's face twisted into something smug, something victorious. "That'll teach her," he thought. "That'll remind her who's in charge." But then, something shifted. It started as a whisper in the crowd. A single voice, barely audible. Then another. And another. The tension in the room thickened into something electric, something sharp-edged and dangerous. The officer frowned, glancing around. And then, a voice, steady, controlled, yet laced with something deadly, broke through the silence. "Are you finished?" His smirk faltered. The murmurs grew louder. Then, the judge cleared his throat. The bailiff hesitated, looking toward the court reporter, who had stopped typing. The officer glanced at the attorneys, expecting outrage on his behalf, expecting someone to stand up and reprimand this woman for her insolence. But they weren't looking at her. They were looking at him. And they weren't angry. They were afraid. A shift in the air. A crack in his confidence. Then, the words that would unravel everything. "Officer, do you even know who you just put your hands on?" Something in his gut twisted. He swallowed hard. The room had changed. The energy. The weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing down. And then, 4 words. 4 words that would take everything he thought he knew and flip it upside down, that would rip the ground out from under his feet. "She's your superior officer." Dead silence. The color drained from his face. No. That was impossible. That was a mistake. She was a nobody. A nothing. She wasn't supposed to be anything. But the gavel slammed. The judge sat forward, looking at him not with anger, but with something worse, something colder. Disgust. The murmurs turned into something else now. Not whispers. Not speculation. Laughter. Not loud, not overt. Just enough to slice through his skin. Just enough to let him know, this was the beginning of his downfall. He had spent years in this system, bending it to his will, believing he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, the system wasn't bending for him. Now, it was turning against him. And this was just the beginning. What happens next will leave you speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination in all forms. This story isn't just about a shocking twist, it's about justice, accountability, and the power of truth. To every black viewer watching, know that your voice, your dignity, and your worth matter. We support you, we see you, and we stand with you. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional ride. Stay until the end, you won't regret it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to support more powerful stories like this. Enjoy the story. The morning light bled through the towering glass windows of the courthouse, casting long, deliberate shadows across the marble floors. The building itself stood as a monolith of justice, or, at least, what justice was supposed to be. Inside, men in tailored suits murmured over files, paralegals shuffled papers at a frantic pace, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered from the vending machines lining the hallways. It was a place where fates were decided, where words carried the weight of consequences, and where, far too often, those consequences were not distributed equally. Among the constant movement, Lorraine Carter stood unmoving. Her posture was composed, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady. Every movement she made was calculated, deliberate, with the ease of someone who had spent years mastering the art of control. She was a woman who had learned, early on, that the world did not grant power to people like her freely, she had taken it. Earned it. Fought for it. And yet, she had no illusions about the battlefield she still walked through every day. Lorraine had built her career on precision. She had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, had spent nights buried in case files, had watched men with half her intelligence be promoted ahead of her simply because of who they were and who they weren't. But none of it had stopped her. Step by step, year by year, she had climbed, never allowing herself to falter, never giving anyone a single reason to doubt that she belonged at the top. And now, she was at the very top. As the chief of the United States Police Force, she had more authority than almost anyone in law enforcement. She was the one who decided who stayed and who went. She could dismantle entire departments if they failed to meet the standards of justice she demanded. She had more power in one signature than most officers did in their entire careers. But, despite that, she had learned one unshakable truth: power did not erase prejudice. Power did not shield her from the looks, the murmurs, the quiet resistance from men who still believed she had no place among them. One of those men was Bradley Moore. Bradley had been a cop for nearly 15 years, and in that time, he had perfected the art of surviving the system. He knew how to navigate the gray areas, how to manipulate reports, how to make sure things always landed in his favor. He had that smirk, the one that made it clear he thought himself untouchable. He wasn't the loud, overt racist, no, he was smarter than that. He was the kind of man who let his actions speak for him. A routine stop that turned violent. A report that conveniently left out certain details. A suspect who somehow resisted just enough to end up bloodied. He had risen through the ranks, not because of merit, but because he knew how to play the game. He made the right friends, laughed at the right jokes, kept his head low when he needed to, and let his aggression fly when he knew it would be overlooked. He was everything wrong with the system, wrapped in the perfect package of respectability. And now, standing in the courtroom, Bradley felt that familiar surge of authority, the comfort of knowing he was in control. This wasn't his first time testifying. He had been on the stand before, giving statements, backing up his fellow officers, making sure the right narrative was told. Today was no different. Another day, another case, another opportunity to remind everyone in this room who had the real power. He had been called in to testify against another officer, a rookie who had made the mistake of crossing the wrong people. Bradley wasn't worried. The department always protected its own. But then, he saw her. At first, she barely registered in his mind. Just another black woman. Just another face. And then, something about the way she stood, unfazed, arms crossed, watching, irritated him. He didn't like it when people didn't show the proper amount of respect. He didn't like it when people like her thought they could challenge him, stand in his space, act like they belonged. He had spent his whole career making sure people like her knew their place. Bradley squared his shoulders and stepped closer. "What are you even doing here?" His voice was low, just enough to be heard by those nearby, just enough to humiliate without causing too much of a scene. "This is no place for you." She didn't react. That made his blood burn. "You deaf? I asked you a question." Still nothing. His fingers twitched. His jaw clenched. He had seen this look before, the defiance, the refusal to bow. He hated it. It reminded him of the ones who didn't cower when he pulled them over, the ones who had the nerve to ask why they were being stopped, the ones who wouldn't let him intimidate them into silence. He stepped closer. Close enough to make sure she understood. "People like you," he sneered, "should know better than to stand where you don't belong." And then, without thinking, without hesitation, he did it. His hand moved before his mind even caught up. The slap rang through the air, sharp, sudden, final. For a moment, everything stopped. The courtroom fell into an unnatural silence. Even the judge, who had been shuffling papers, froze mid-motion. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered something under their breath. A few exchanged nervous glances, waiting to see what would happen next. Lorraine barely moved. Her head had turned slightly from the force of the slap, her cheeks stinging with the fresh heat of impact. But her body? Her posture? Unchanged. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze back to him. Bradley expected anger. He expected shouting. He expected some outburst of emotion, some moment of weakness he could latch onto, something that would prove she was just another nobody, another insignificant obstacle in his path. Instead, she simply looked at him. And smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A curve of the lips, a flicker of something in her eyes that sent an unfamiliar chill down his spine. Then, the murmurs started. A ripple of whispers spreading through the crowd. A shift in energy, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The judge glanced toward the court reporter, who had stopped typing. The bailiff looked uneasy. And then, someone cleared their throat. A voice, steady and measured, filled the space. "Officer Moore, do you even know who you just put your hands on?" The color drained from his face. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the smugness clean off his features. He turned, looking at the judge, then the attorneys, searching for someone, anyone, who would step in, who would tell him this was all some misunderstanding. And then, for words that shattered his world. "She's your superior officer." His stomach twisted into knots. His hands went numb. The room spun in slow motion. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how things worked. He was the one who made the rules. He was the one who decided who got to walk away and who didn't. But now, for the first time in his life, Bradley Moore realized, he was the one who wasn't walking away. And this? This was just the beginning. The silence inside the courtroom had transformed into something heavy, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that stretched, that pressed into the walls, that made every shift of fabric, every nervous breath, every subtle movement feel deafening. It was the kind of silence that didn't simply fill a room, it swallowed it whole. Bradley Moore stood frozen in place, his body rigid, his throat dry, his mind scrambling for something, anything, that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing. No excuse. No clever words. No escape. The slap had echoed in the air, a sound that refused to fade. He could still feel the sensation of it vibrating through his hand, the sting of his own action lingering in his palm. It had been automatic. Instinctual. An assertion of power. Of dominance. The same way he had asserted himself countless times before. The same way he had reminded people where they stood in relation to him. He had done it without hesitation, without thought, because that was the world he knew, the world where men like him were untouchable, unquestionable, unshakable. But this time, something was different. The moment those words had been spoken, the moment someone in that room had dared to say them aloud, the ground beneath him shifted. It was as if everything he thought he understood had suddenly been rewritten in an instant. "She's your superior officer." His breath came shallow, uneven. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the weight of 100 stares piercing through his uniform. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't the way power was supposed to flow. His entire career had been built on a foundation of control, of knowing exactly where he stood in every room, in every situation. But right now, that foundation was cracking. Lorraine Carter had not flinched. Had not stumbled. Had not reacted in any of the ways he had expected. She had taken the hit, absorbed the humiliation, and then, simply looked at him. With that same quiet certainty, that same unshaken presence that made his stomach twist. The judge cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, deliberate, an attempt to reassert control over a courtroom that was rapidly slipping into chaos. His voice, when he spoke, was measured but edged with something unmistakable, contained fury. "Officer Moore," he said, his gaze locking onto Bradley with the weight of authority, "do you fully comprehend the gravity of what you have just done?" Bradley swallowed hard. His tongue felt thick, his mouth dry, his pulse hammering against his skull. He had no idea what to say. No script to follow. No carefully curated response that could make this go away. For the first time in his life, he was standing on the wrong side of the system. He tried to speak, his voice raw, uneven, foreign even to himself. "Your Honor, but the words died before they could take shape. There was nothing he could say. He had hit a woman in a courtroom. A black woman. His superior officer. And every single person in this room had witnessed it. Lorraine's voice cut through the tension, steady, unwavering. "I think we're all waiting for that answer." Bradley turned to her, his body stiff, his fingers curled into fists. He wanted to fight back. To defend himself. To say something that would tilt the balance of power back in his favor. But the moment had already passed. The tide had shifted. And he was drowning. The murmurs were growing. Lawyers whispering urgently to their clients. Reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. A court clerk stealing glances at the judge, as if waiting for a directive. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen everything, looked tense, unsure whether he should intervene or simply let the moment play out. The assistant district attorney, a sharp-eyed man with years of experience and a reputation for being ruthless, stood. His voice carried through the room with practiced authority. "Your Honor, given the severity of what has just taken place, I believe we need to take immediate action regarding Officer Moore's conduct." Bradley felt his stomach tighten. Immediate action. That phrase had never applied to him before. He had seen it happen to others, men who didn't have the right connections, the right background, the right skin color. But not to him. Never to him. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple as though warding off the headache that this moment had just delivered. "Officer Moore, I suggest you prepare yourself for the reality that this court will be dealing with you in a very different manner than you are accustomed to." Bradley's stomach clenched. The room felt smaller. Hotter. The walls pressing in. Lorraine didn't look at him as she walked past. She didn't need to. He felt the shift in power. He felt the weight of his own downfall pressing onto his shoulders. The realization that everything he had built was crumbling, and there wasn't a single thing he could do to stop it. The moment Lorraine stepped out of the courtroom, the storm erupted. Reporters, already alerted to the chaos unfolding inside, swarmed forward like vultures to a carcass. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust into her face. Their voices clashed in a desperate attempt to be the first to get a quote, a statement, a reaction. "Chief Carter, what's your response to the assault? Did you see this coming? Will you be pressing charges against Officer Moore?" She didn't slow her pace. She didn't waver. She had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this, for battles waged in the court of public opinion. She had watched men like Bradley thrive under the protection of silence, under the shield of a system designed to protect them. But this time, the shield had cracked. A voice, louder than the rest, broke through the chaos. "Chief Carter, do you believe justice will be served?" She paused. The world held its breath. Then, she turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Her eyes locked onto the cameras, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but razor-sharp. "I believe," she said, each word deliberate, measured, "that justice is long overdue." Inside the courthouse, Bradley sat frozen, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions, each one leading to a dead end. His lawyer was speaking, the words a blur of damage control, of strategy, of minimizing fallout. But Bradley wasn't listening. He could hear the voices outside. The storm was growing. His name was already being whispered in disbelief, in disgust. For years, he had walked through fire and never been burned. But this time, the flames were creeping closer. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. The cold, sterile air of the police precinct weighed heavy with tension. Every movement, every footstep, every barely audible murmur seemed to carry a charge, a crackling energy that warned of an impending storm. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow that made everything feel more exposed, more unforgiving. Behind the thick glass windows of the interrogation room, Bradley Moore sat hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his fingers interlocked so hard they had turned pale. He looked nothing like the arrogant officer who had stood tall in the courtroom just hours ago. Now, stripped of his uniform, stripped of his badge, stripped of the authority he had once wielded so effortlessly, he looked smaller. Powerless. Across from him, Lorraine Carter sat with the same unwavering composure she had carried in that courtroom. Her presence alone was enough to suffocate him, to make his skin itch with something unfamiliar, dread. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even looking at him like he was worth the energy of her contempt. And that, more than anything, made his insides twist. He had expected fury. He had expected threats, a confrontation, something he could sink his teeth into. But the silence? The control? That was worse. That was terrifying. A clock on the wall ticked steadily. Each second an anchor, dragging him deeper into the weight of what he had done. What he had lost. Lorraine exhaled, the sound measured, deliberate. "You look nervous." Bradley's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous." Lorraine tilted her head slightly, her gaze unreadable. "Is it?" He leaned back, crossing his arms, forcing an air of indifference he didn't actually feel. "I've got nothing to say." Lorraine nodded, as if she had expected that response. "Good. Because I'm not here for excuses." She leaned forward just slightly, just enough for him to feel the shift in control. "I want you to sit there and listen." His lips parted, as if he wanted to protest, but the words never came. Something in her tone, in the way she spoke with absolute certainty, made him hesitate. "Do you know how many officers I've dealt with like you?" she continued, her voice smooth but cutting. "The ones who think the badge gives them power over people instead of responsibility. The ones who don't just break the rules but reshape them in their favor." She let the words sink in, watching as his fingers twitched slightly against the table. "Men like you think you own the system. That it works for you. That it will always protect you." A pause, her gaze steady. "Tell me, Officer Moore, how does it feel now that the system is looking at you differently?" Bradley scoffed, shaking his head. Spare me the speech. Oh, you misunderstand, Lorraine said, her voice light, almost amused. This isn't a speech. This is me making something very clear to you. She leaned back, folding her hands neatly on the table. You don't have control anymore. Not here. Not out there. You are no longer the man people fear in a uniform. You are no longer the one who walks away untouched while everyone else suffers the consequences of your actions. He swallowed hard, looking away. This is all political bullshit. They're making an example out of me. Lorraine's brow lifted slightly, the smallest flicker of amusement crossing her features. An example? She leaned in again, her voice lowering just slightly. No, Officer Moore. This is accountability. Bradley exhaled sharply, his frustration breaking through the cracks of his failing composure. You don't know what it's like. Being in this job. The pressure. The way you have to, Lorraine's voice cut through him like a blade. Don't. Her expression darkened, her patience thinning. Don't sit there and try to justify yourself to me. Don't act like this is about the job. This is about you. Your choices. Your abuse of power. Your entitlement. She let the silence settle for a moment, let the weight of her words press down on him. You didn't slap me because of pressure, Officer Moore. You did it because you thought you could. His eyes flickered toward her, a brief flash of defiance, but it was weak, desperate. You don't know me. You're right, she said. I don't. But I know men like you. And I know how this ends. He scoffed again, shaking his head, but she could see the unease in the way his jaw clenched, in the way his fingers tapped anxiously against the table. You think you won? He muttered, voice low. This won't last. They always protect their own. Lorraine tilted her head, as if studying him, as if genuinely curious. Do they? A slow smile, calculated and cold. Because last I checked, you're sitting here alone. The weight of that truth settled in. His face twitched, his confidence cracking further. The door behind them creaked open. A new presence entered. A man in a dark suit, expression unreadable. He stepped beside Lorraine, sliding a thick folder onto the table, letting it land with a heavy, deliberate thud. Bradley's stomach twisted. Officer Moore, the man said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had been in too many rooms like this before. Do you understand the severity of the situation you're in? Bradley's throat felt tight. This is a misunderstanding. The man ignored him, opening the folder, flipping through the pages slowly, methodically. Assaulting a superior officer in a court of law. Gross misconduct. Multiple complaints against you, some of which have been conveniently overlooked until now. He turned a page. Oh, and look at that. Excessive force incidents. Reports that don't quite match up. Witness testimonies that paint a very different picture than the ones you filed. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I'd say this is more than a misunderstanding. Bradley felt the room shrinking. His world, once so vast, so untouchable, was now nothing more than four walls pressing in on him. Lorraine watched him, her expression calm, patient. Officer Moore, she said, her voice almost gentle now, almost sympathetic. Do you know what happens next? His fingers curled into fists. He wanted to fight. He wanted to claw his way out of this moment, to turn back time, to undo what couldn't be undone. But deep down, beneath all the arrogance, all the bravado, all the years of thinking himself untouchable, he knew. This time, there was no getting away with it. And the worst part? He never saw it coming. The walls of the interrogation room felt closer now, pressing in, suffocating. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with a tension that Bradley Moore had never known before, not like this, not with him on this side of the table. His world had always been one of certainty, of control, of knowing exactly how far he could push and just how much he could get away with. But now, as he sat across from Lorraine Carter, that certainty was gone. It had been ripped from him the moment his hand had made contact with her face, the moment his arrogance had driven him to act without thinking. And now? Now he was paying the price. Lorraine sat still, her fingers laced together in front of her, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something deadly. Not anger. Not even triumph. Just finality. She knew. She had known from the moment it happened that this moment would come, that he would end up here, stripped of everything, forced to face the reality of his own downfall. And she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of rage. No, that would be too easy for him. Instead, she gave him the one thing he had never been forced to experience, accountability. The man beside her, the one with the thick folder full of every sin Bradley had ever committed, turned another page, the sound of paper flipping slicing through the silence like a blade. "Officer Moore," the man said again, his voice steady, calculated, designed to strip away any illusion of control that Bradley might still be clinging to. "You've had a long career. 15 years in the department. That's a lot of time to build a reputation." Bradley's throat was dry, his palms damp. "This is, spare me," the man cut him off, shaking his head. "You want to say it's a misunderstanding? That you didn't mean it? That it was a lapse in judgment? Because I have 15 years worth of lapses in judgment sitting in this file." He let the weight of that settle, flipping through more pages. Excessive force reports. Witness complaints. Suspiciously vague incident reports. "You've had the system protecting you for years, Officer Moore. But not anymore." Bradley's fingers twitched. "This is political," he muttered, his voice low, bitter. "This is just another witch hunt." Lorraine finally spoke then, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Is it?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Or is it just that, for the first time, you're not the one calling the shots?" Bradley's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling in short, uneven breaths. He could feel it now, the slow, creeping weight of reality sinking in, wrapping around his throat, squeezing. He wasn't getting out of this. He wasn't going to be able to walk away from this like he always had before. The system that had shielded him, protected him, turned a blind eye to his actions, it was no longer on his side. And worse? Lorraine Carter was. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to make him feel the shift in power between them. "You've spent years deciding who gets to walk free and who doesn't. You've manipulated the truth, rewritten reports, buried complaints. You've made people suffer for no reason other than the fact that you could." Her voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "But today, Officer Moore, it's your turn." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, grasping for some sense of control. "You think this makes you better than me?" His voice was harsher now, laced with something desperate. "You think sitting there, acting all righteous, changes anything? You're just as much a part of this system as I am." Lorraine didn't flinch. "No," she said simply. "I'm a part of the system that is finally holding you accountable." The man beside her spoke again, flipping to another section of the file. "Assaulting a superior officer in a courtroom isn't something we can sweep under the rug, Officer Moore. Neither is the pattern of behavior that's been uncovered since then." He looked up, expression blank, unreadable. "You're going to be facing multiple charges. Assault. Official misconduct. Civil rights violations. And let's not forget the internal investigation that's already underway." Bradley felt his stomach drop. Civil rights violations. That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. That wasn't something that got settled quietly with a resignation and a pension. That was the kind of thing that made headlines, that destroyed reputations, that put people like him behind bars. He forced a smirk, though it was weak, hollow. "And what? You think putting me away changes anything? You think it fixes the system? You're fooling yourself. Lorraine exhaled softly, almost as if she pitied him. You still don't get it, she said, shaking her head. This was never about fixing the entire system. This is about fixing you. Bradley's face twitched, the muscles in his jaw locking. The man in the suit closed the file, folding his hands over it. Officer Moore, you have two choices. You can cooperate, make this easier on yourself, or, he let the silence linger, the weight of unspoken consequences filling the space between them. Bradley swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists under the table. He had spent his whole career believing he was untouchable. That no matter what he did, no matter how far he pushed the line, there would always be someone to pull him back. But now, as he sat there, stripped of his uniform, stripped of his badge, stripped of everything that had once made him feel powerful, he realized, he was alone. Lorraine stood then, pushing her chair back with quiet finality. She looked down at him, her expression calm, resolute. You should get used to this feeling, Officer Moore, she said, her voice almost gentle. Because this is just the beginning. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him there, trapped in the weight of everything he had lost. The weight of everything that had just transpired settled thick in the air, pressing down on Bradley Moore like an anvil. His world had shrunk into the walls of the interrogation room, into the reality he could no longer deny. He had been left alone now, abandoned in a cold space that no longer belonged to him, no longer bent to his authority. He had spent his career enforcing order, deciding fates, dictating consequences. But now, he was the one being judged. The system he had once manipulated to his advantage was now the same system that had him in its grasp, and for the first time, there was no one left to protect him. The door had closed behind Lorraine Carter minutes ago, and yet, her presence still lingered in the room, as if the very walls had absorbed her final words. This is just the beginning. The way she had said it, not with anger, not with triumph, but with certainty, had rattled something deep inside him. He had thought this was a momentary setback, that someone would step in and smooth this over like they always had before. But the silence that followed her departure told him the truth. This time, there was no undoing what had been done. A slow, creeping nausea settled in his stomach as he finally allowed himself to process the reality of his situation. The suspension of his badge had been immediate, his gun confiscated on the spot. His name had already started circulating in the media, and the headlines were not in his favor. He had seen officers go down before, but never like this. Never with this level of scrutiny, this level of certainty that the system was turning its back on one of its own. His lawyer had promised they would fight this, but even he had looked uneasy, flipping through pages of accusations that had been swept under the rug for years but had now resurfaced with a vengeance. The evidence against him was damning, not just because of what he had done in that courtroom, but because of everything that had come before it. The complaints that had been ignored, the excessive force reports that had mysteriously disappeared, the incidents that had always ended in his favor. It had all come back to haunt him, and there was no escaping it now. The internal affairs investigation had turned into something much larger, something beyond just one slap in a courtroom. They were digging deeper, unraveling the years of misconduct that had once been buried beneath bureaucracy and silence. His phone had been confiscated, but even if he had it, he knew better than to check. He didn't need to see the messages, the calls from the people who had once called him a friend, a brother. He knew what they would say, or worse, what they wouldn't. He had spent years believing that loyalty was the only currency that mattered in the force, that as long as you played by the rules of the brotherhood, you were untouchable. But he had forgotten the one rule that mattered most: when the storm comes, they will always protect themselves first. And he was the storm now. He was the one they would sacrifice to preserve the image of the department. He was the liability they could no longer afford. A knock at the door made him flinch, his body tensing instinctively. The door creaked open, and the man in the suit stepped back in, the same unshakable, unreadable expression on his face. He took his time, settling into the chair across from Bradley, flipping open the thick folder once more. There was no urgency in his movements, no need for intimidation, because he already knew they had one. "The district attorney's office has officially filed charges," the man said, his voice calm, methodical. "You're looking at assault of a superior officer, gross misconduct, obstruction of justice, and pending civil rights violations." He flipped a page. "The department has begun the process of termination. Your pension is being reviewed. If convicted, you could be facing up to 15 years. He looked up, meeting Bradley's eyes for the first time. That's a long time for someone who once thought himself untouchable. Bradley's throat was dry. His fingers curled against the table, nails pressing into the cold metal. "You're making a mistake." The man exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "The only mistake was assuming you were untouchable." Bradley clenched his jaw, his mind scrambling for something, anything that could turn this around. "You think throwing me to the wolves is going to fix anything? You think getting rid of me makes you the good guys?" His voice was sharper now, edged with something desperate. "The system you work for is the same one I worked for. We all play by the same rules." The man studied him for a moment, and then, with an almost amused sigh, he shook his head. "No, Officer Moore. You played by your rules." He leaned in slightly. "And you lost." The words hit harder than Bradley wanted to admit. The man pushed the folder toward him. "You have a decision to make," he said simply. "You can fight this, take your chances in court, drag this out, and hope for leniency. Or," he let the silence settle for a moment, allowing the weight of the alternative to sink in. "You can take a deal." Bradley's heart pounded. "A deal?" The man nodded, flipping to another page. "You plead guilty to the assault charge. You cooperate fully with the civil rights investigation into your past misconduct. In exchange, you avoid the maximum sentence." Bradley's stomach twisted. Cooperate. That meant turning over everything. That meant giving them names, details, information that would burn every bridge he had left. He had spent his entire career being protected by the very system that was now demanding he dismantle it piece by piece. And if he didn't? He already knew the answer. His silence stretched for too long, and the man sighed, closing the folder once more. "You don't have to decide now," he said, standing. "But you don't have much time." Bradley wanted to argue, wanted to find a way out of this, wanted to believe there was still someone on his side. But as the man left the room, leaving him alone once again, he knew the truth. He was out of time. And for the first time in his life, he had to face the consequences. Alone. The interrogation room felt smaller now, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the size of the space and everything to do with the weight pressing down on Bradley Moore's chest. The echoes of his own breathing, sharp and uneven, filled the silence, mingling with the distant hum of fluorescent lights that flickered above him. He stared at the table, his knuckles white as his fists clenched against the cold metal surface. The words still rang in his ears, looping over and over, refusing to fade. "You played by your rules. And you lost." He had spent his entire career convinced that losing wasn't an option for men like him. That no matter how close the fire got, he would always walk away untouched. But now, sitting here, stripped of his badge, his authority, his certainty, he realized he had been wrong. The system had never truly been his. It had only used him, the same way he had used it, until he was no longer worth protecting. And now, he was the one being sacrificed. The door opened again, but this time, it wasn't the lawyer, or the man in the suit, or anyone else looking to finalize the details of his demise. It was Lorraine Carter. She stepped inside with the same unwavering presence she had carried through the entire ordeal, her expression as unreadable as ever. No triumph. No rage. Just quiet, absolute control. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table, tilting her head slightly as if she were studying a man who had already been sentenced before a verdict was even reached. Bradley forced himself to meet her gaze, to hold it, to keep himself from shrinking under it. "So what, you're here to gloat?" His voice was rough, edged with something bitter, something almost desperate. "To watch me fall apart? To get the satisfaction of seeing me like this?" Lorraine's eyes didn't waver. "No," she said simply, her tone even, measured. "I'm here because I want you to understand." Bradley scoffed, shaking his head. "Understand what? That I made a mistake. That I should feel bad. I don't need a damn lecture." Lorraine exhaled through her nose, calm, unaffected by his attempts to provoke her. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to tell you the truth. And whether you want to listen to it or not, that's up to you." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, leaning back in his chair. "The truth? You think you know the truth about me?" Lorraine held his gaze. "I know exactly who you are." Something about the way she said it, steady, with complete certainty, sent a chill up his spine. "You think this is just about the slap," she continued, her voice smooth but firm. "You think this is just about a moment of bad judgment. But that's not why you're here, Bradley. That's not why you lost everything." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "Then enlighten me." Lorraine leaned in slightly, just enough to close the space between them, just enough to make sure he heard every single word. "You are here because you built your career on the belief that there would never be consequences. You are here because, for years, you decided who suffered and who walked free, and you always made sure you were the one who walked free. You thought the rules didn't apply to you. That there would always be someone to cover for you, to clean up your messes, to turn the other way when things got ugly." She tilted her head slightly. "But tell me, Officer Moore. Where are they now?" His stomach twisted, his fingers curling into fists. "Screw you." She didn't flinch. "No one is coming to save you," she said, voice low, deliberate. "Not your department. Not the people you thought were your friends. Not the system you swore would always protect you. Because the second you became more of a liability than an asset, they left you to rot. And that?" She leaned back, folding her arms. "That is justice." Bradley felt something break inside him, something deep, something terrifying. "This isn't justice," he snapped, his voice sharp, his composure cracking. "This is revenge." Lorraine's lips curled, not into a smile, not into amusement, but into something knowing. "If it were revenge," she said, tilting her head slightly, "you wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation." He let out a breath through his nose, shaking his head, his mind racing for something, anything, to turn this back around. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life, he was the one with no way out. The door opened again, and this time, it was the lawyer. The man in the suit. The one who had laid out the terms of his choices in clear, unforgiving language. "It's time," the man said simply. Bradley's jaw clenched, his breath uneven. He knew what they wanted. He knew the deal was still on the table. But taking it meant giving up the last shred of control he had left. Taking it meant admitting that he had lost. Lorraine stood, smoothing down her jacket, exhaling as she looked down at him one last time. "You think this is the worst day of your life," she said, voice quiet, certain. "But it's only the first." She turned, walking toward the door, pausing just before stepping through. "Make the right choice," she said over her shoulder. "Or don't. Either way, you're done." And then she was gone. The room fell silent once more. Bradley Moore, once untouchable, once certain of his own invincibility, sat there, staring at the papers laid out before him, realizing, for the first time, that he had no idea what it felt like to be powerless. And it was the worst feeling in the world. The paper in front of Bradley Moore felt heavier than it should have. The words blurred at the edges, his vision tunneling as his mind tried to reject the reality pressing down on him. His name was printed in bold letters at the top, followed by the cold, mechanical language of the legal system, a system he had once controlled, manipulated, bent to his will. Now, it sat in judgment of him. The deal was laid out in black and white, clear, unforgiving. Cooperate and salvage whatever was left of his life, or fight and lose everything. The man in the suit sat across from him, waiting. No pressure, no urgency, just the quiet expectation that Bradley would come to the inevitable conclusion on his own. He had seen this play out before, 1,000 times, with other men who had thought they were invincible, who had believed they could outrun their mistakes. But in the end, the system always caught up. It was a slow-moving machine, grinding forward with painful deliberation, but once it had its sights set on you, there was no stopping it. Bradley swallowed, his throat dry, his hands trembling slightly as he ran his fingers over the edge of the document. "And if I don't sign this?" His voice was rough, stripped of its usual confidence, its usual authority. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Then we move forward with the full charges. You go to trial. And given the evidence against you, the public scrutiny, and the political pressure on this case, you will lose." He let the silence stretch for a moment, let the weight of his words sink in. "And you will serve time." Bradley let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You say that like it's already decided." The lawyer didn't blink. "It is." Bradley gritted his teeth, his body tensing as 1,000 emotions clashed inside him, anger, humiliation, fear. "So that's it? I just roll over. Let them take everything from me?" The lawyer tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No one is taking anything from you, Officer Moore. You did this to yourself." The words hit harder than Bradley wanted to admit. He clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the pen that had been placed in front of him. The weight of the moment pressed against his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. He had spent his entire career believing he was the one in control, the one who dictated the rules, who decided how far the line could be pushed. But now, sitting here, staring down at the cold finality of the paper in front of him, he realized, he had never truly been in control at all. A knock on the door broke the silence. It was soft, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried weight before the person even entered the room. The door opened slowly, and Lorraine Carter stepped inside. Bradley's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to come back. She didn't sit this time. She stood by the door, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something sharper than before, something that made Bradley's stomach twist. She nodded toward the paper. "So. What's it gonna be?" Bradley exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "You really want me to sign this, don't you?" Lorraine's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not amusement, just a flicker of something close to understanding. "What I want doesn't matter. What you do. That's on you." Bradley let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You act like this is a choice." Lorraine's eyes darkened slightly. "It is. Just not the kind you're used to." Bradley looked at her then, really looked at her. For the first time, he saw something beyond the calm control, beyond the quiet certainty. There was something colder, something sharper beneath the surface. A lifetime of battles fought in silence. A woman who had spent years navigating a world that had never wanted her to win. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, treated her like she was just another obstacle in his way. And now, she was the one standing on the other side of the table, watching as he crumbled. His fingers twitched against the pen, the weight of the decision settling in his bones. "You ever think," he muttered, voice low, "that maybe none of this changes anything?" Lorraine exhaled softly, tilting her head. "Maybe it doesn't." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the moment breathe. "But it changes everything for you." Bradley swallowed, his throat tight. Lorraine's voice was quieter now, but it carried the same weight, the same certainty that had followed her since the moment she walked into that courtroom. You spent your career making people feel powerless. Now you know what it feels like. She stepped forward slightly, just enough to let him feel the shift in presence, in control. The difference between us, Officer Moore, is that I earned my power. And you? You just lost yours. The words cut deeper than any accusation, any legal threat, any consequence that had been laid out in front of him. It was the final nail in the coffin of who he had once been. He looked down at the paper, the words blurring for a moment before coming back into focus. His name. The charges. The terms of the deal. His hands felt heavy. His body felt numb. Lorraine turned to leave, pausing at the door one last time. This is the last time we'll be in the same room, she said, her voice calm, steady. Whatever happens next, you'll have to face it alone. And then, she was gone. The door closed behind her, and the room fell into silence once more. Bradley Moore, once the man who had dictated the lives of others, now sat alone, staring down at the choice that would define the rest of his life. And for the first time, there was no one left to tell him what to do. Bradley Moore sat motionless, his entire body tense as if bracing for an impact that had already arrived. The courtroom, once a place where he had walked with unchecked confidence, now felt like a tomb closing in around him. The high ceilings and polished wooden benches, the air of rigid authority that had always seemed to favor men like him, now bore down on him with an unforgiving weight. The judge sat above him, the very embodiment of the system he had once manipulated so easily. But today, the system was not bending for him. Today, it was delivering the final blow. The courtroom was filled to capacity, yet it felt eerily quiet. Journalists lined the back rows, their pens poised, their cameras ready to capture the moment that would mark the official fall of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Among them were members of the public, activists, citizens, people who had followed every twist and turn of this case with the kind of intensity reserved for moments of historic reckoning. Some had been personally affected by officers like him. Some had fought for years, demanding accountability from a system that had long ignored their voices. Today, they were here to witness what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Lorraine Carter sat among them, her presence undeniable despite her silence. She had no reason to be here, no obligation to watch the final moments of a man she had already defeated. But this was not about him. It was about everything he represented. About the victims whose voices had never made it to a courtroom. About the ones who never got to see justice served. Today, she sat as a reminder that power could shift, that systems could be challenged, that truth, no matter how long it was buried, would always rise. The judge cleared his throat, the sound sharp, final. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience, with the burden of decisions that had altered the course of countless lives. He had presided over cases of corruption before, but something about this one carried more weight, more scrutiny. His gaze was heavy as he looked down at the defendant before him. Officer Bradley Moore, he began, his voice steady but firm, this court has reviewed the extensive evidence against you, as well as the long history of misconduct that has been brought to light. You have used your position not to protect and serve, but to instill fear, to abuse authority, and to silence those who dared to challenge you. Today, that ends. Bradley felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His lawyer had prepped him for this, had warned him that the judge would likely make an example of him. But hearing the words spoken aloud, feeling them settle into the air like an irreversible curse, made his stomach turn. The court finds you guilty on all counts, the judge continued, the words slicing through the quiet like a blade. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early release. The gavel struck, its echo filling every corner of the room. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, murmurs spread through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief, satisfaction, and quiet, measured relief. This wasn't just a ruling. It was a shift. A moment that would be analyzed, dissected, and debated for years to come. But for Bradley, it was something much simpler. It was the end. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something about appeals, about reviewing the sentencing, about options that no longer felt real. Bradley barely heard him. His mind had gone blank, his body cold. The weight of the cuffs around his wrists felt heavier now, as if they were sinking into his skin, marking him in a way that could never be undone. The guards moved toward him, their faces impassive, indifferent. He was no longer a man of authority. No longer the one giving orders. He was just another inmate now. As he stood, his gaze locked onto Lorraine. She met his eyes with a look that was unreadable, steady, unwavering. He searched for something, anger, triumph, even pity, but there was none. She had already moved on. And that, more than anything, made his insides twist. The courtroom doors opened, and the world outside felt different now. The cameras flashed as he was escorted out, the shouts of reporters blending into an indistinguishable hum. His name was already being written into history, but not in the way he had ever imagined. He had believed in his own invincibility, in the idea that consequences were for other people. But today, there was no escaping them. Time moved forward. The headlines ran their course. The scandal that had once dominated the news cycle faded as the world turned its attention to new outrages, new injustices, new battles to be fought. Bradley Moore, once a name spoken with power, became nothing more than a cautionary tale. In prison, he found no refuge. He had spent his career making enemies, and now, there was no badge to protect him. He was no longer feared. He was no longer respected. He was nothing. Lorraine Carter, meanwhile, continued her work, not because of this case, but despite it. One man's downfall did not undo decades of injustice. One victory did not mean the war had been won. But it was a crack in the foundation, a shift in the balance, a moment that proved the fight was not in vain. She had never sought revenge, never needed personal satisfaction. What she had wanted, what she had always fought for, was justice. And today, she had seen it. But the question remains, what does justice really look like? Is it a prison sentence? A career ruined? Or is it something deeper, something that cannot be measured in years served or headlines written? Justice is not about one man's downfall. It is about ensuring that men like him never rise again. And now, I turn to you. What do you think? Was this justice? Or just another drop in an ocean of necessary change? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge perspectives and uncover the truths that need to be told, subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. If you believe stories like this matter, hit that like button and help us keep the conversation going. Because justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. One case at a time.